Now that the expedition leaders were in place, supplies had to be gathered, and an expedition party formed. They would travel by keelboat, so they would have room only for the most necessary items: pots and pans, cloths, and trade items. Lewis met Clark at the Falls of the Ohio River on October 15, 1803. They began to assemble a crew. When selecting volunteers for the expedition, Lewis and Clark recruited men who could perform specific tasks that would be needed along the way. They recruited hunters, gunsmiths, and carpenters. They found boat builders and men who could navigate boats upriver. Lewis and Clark traveled down the Ohio River. Along the way, they hired an interpreter, George Drouillard, who was part French-Canadian and part Shawnee Indian. Also assisting them was Clark's African-American slave, York. York performed many roles during the expedition. He was given many of the same tasks and privileges of the white men, and aided in the hunting. He helped guard the traveling party and assisted setting up camp. He was also present during many of the party's encounters with the Indians, the first black man most of the Indians had ever seen. Where the Ohio met the Mississippi River, the party turned north and traveled up the Mississippi to St. Louis at the mouth of the Missouri River. St. Louis was then a small town, but it was the center of fur trading for the whole region. There, they set up winter camp and finalized their selection of 22 men led by 3 sergeants. They also hired 2 French guides. When they set out up the Missouri on May 14, 1804, they were escorted by soldiers for part of the way. In all, the traveling party upon departure numbered 45 men. As they struggled to navigate their boat up the river against the current, Lewis often went on land by foot to study the countryside and the wildlife inhabiting it. The vast wilderness impressed him deeply, and he often paused to sketch the wildlife he encountered: the bison, the fox, the mountain lion. The first American Indians they met along their journey were the Otos and Missouri of the Great Plains region. They held a council in which Lewis addressed the Indians.
One of the directives from Thomas Jefferson to the captains was to inform all of the native people out there in this territory that the title of the land had been transferred from Spain to France and now to the United States. And then he intended to carry out his vision for this big piece of land.
In the European tradition, there's land and people have title to the land, therefore they own it. In Indian cultures, almost all of them, there's no sense of it. Somebody owns property. Everybody lives on the land. Everybody uses the land.
In the cases where you only had sign language trying to convey this message, I could see where it would be very difficult to convey that message that the president wanted to get out there to the Native American people.
As the party moved further up the Missouri River in what today is South Dakota, Lewis and Clark were barred from continuing by the Teton Sioux Indians. Both sides raised their weapons and made threats, but the two sides made peace before armed conflict took place. The Sioux relented to let Lewis and Clark pass through after securing the gift of tobacco.
And I think at the time Lewis and Clark were coming through, I don't think most of the Native American people had any idea about what was really to follow. That the vision of the president was to open up this land for settlers and for agriculture. And in the process of doing that, the Indian tribes would all be displaced.
The expedition continued north along the Missouri, where they encountered the Mandan and the Hidatsa Indians in what is now North Dakota. The Mandan villages were trading centers, hosting many Indian tribes, as well as French and British traders. Wintertime was now approaching again, and in this part of the country, the winters could become extremely cold and severe. The Lewis and Clark expedition needed to stop for the winter. The Mandan were friendly to the expedition and agreed to allow Lewis and Clark to build Fort Mandan, where they waited out the winter of 1805. While staying among the Mandan, Lewis and Clark hired a French-Canadian named Toussaint Charbonneau to be a translator as they continued west. Charbonneau had a young wife, Sacagawea, who was a Shoshone Indian. Sacagawea had been kidnapped by the Hidatsa when she was a girl and brought up by them. Because the expedition was heading toward Shoshone territory, she wanted to go along to be reunited with her people. Lewis sought her translation abilities as well as those of her husband. Sacagawea was to become an indispensable part of the expedition. When Lewis and Clark first met Charbonneau and Sacagawea, she was close to being ready to give birth to a baby. The baby boy named Jean-Baptiste was born at Fort Mandan. For the rest of the journey, Sacagawea carried her baby along with her. In the meantime, she was needed not only for her translating skills, but also to perform other duties.
In addition to interpreting, she served as a caregiver. She collected food. All along the journey, she knew every edible plant, the berries, roots, all of those kinds of things which supplemented Lewis and Clark's diet, because they did have hunters, but they didn't have fresh wild game all the time. And so she provided food and supplemented their diet, which helped to keep them healthy.
Sacagawea was very happy about the chance she would get to be reunited with her Shoshone kinsmen. She also looked kindly upon Lewis and Clark. A strong friendship developed between Clark and the Charbonneau family. In April of 1805, the expedition left Fort Mandan and continued westward in search of the Missouri River's source. They switched from the big keelboat to lighter dugout canoes because the river got shallower and harder to navigate. It was on May 26th that Lewis finally laid eyes on the much-anticipated Rocky Mountains in the distance. He wrote, "While I viewed these mountains, I felt a secret pleasure in finding myself so near the head of the heretofore conceived boundless Missouri." In the early summer, the party reached a point on the Missouri near what is now Great Falls, Montana. Lewis described what he saw as this sublimely grand spectacle, the grandest sight I ever beheld. The explorers had to go around the falls, which took a month. They had to climb up into the Rockies to get to the Missouri's source, a small mountain stream.
When Lewis and Clark discovered the source of the Missouri River, it accomplished one of Jefferson's big objectives for the exploration. And the hope was that once the source of the Missouri was discovered, they could trace a series of waterways from there and find the Northwest Passage that they were looking for.
They found a triple fork in the Missouri, mapping what would be named the Jefferson, Madison, and Gallatin rivers. They paddled up the Jefferson. Just ahead was a mountain ridge that Lewis eagerly climbed. On October 16, 1805, they saw the banks of the Columbia River. The party hoped to find that the Columbia River led west to the Pacific Ocean. This could have been the Northwest Passage they sought, the most important of Jefferson's goals for the expedition. Instead, Lewis described what he saw: immense ranges of high mountains still to the west of us, with their tops partially covered with snow. He stood at Limy Pass on today's Montana-Idaho border at the Continental Divide, looking at the Bitterroot Range of the Rocky Mountains. The dream of finding a Northwest Passage was dashed that day.
The trip through the mountains would be very, very difficult for the whole expedition, and they knew this before they even got there. They knew they would need horses, and before they left the villages along Knife River, they knew that they would have to acquire horses from the Shoshone.
All might have ended badly for Lewis and Clark had Sacagawea not been on the expedition with them. Not only was she a member of the same Shoshone tribe as these Indians, she discovered that her own brother Camawait was the chief of the village. It was an extraordinary twist of fate. Seeing his sister helped convince Camawait to trust the white men. With Sacagawea's help, the Shoshone agreed to provide horses in exchange for the goods that Lewis and Clark offered. They described a trail through the Bitterroots that led to a tributary of the Columbia River.
This is in the summertime, and yet the snow would be chest deep to the horses. There were no trails, there were no paths. It would be treacherous and difficult. And It took a long time for them to cross the mountains, but they encountered the Nez Perce, who would assist them not only with food, but also as guides.
The Nez Perce kept their horses for them, while Lewis and Clark traveled west down the turbulent Clearwater and Snake Rivers and onto the Columbia River. The explorers were tired, but discovered renewed energy as they noticed the river gradually widening, the water becoming salty and ebbing and flowing with the ocean tide. They knew the Pacific Ocean was near. Visibility was extremely poor as the explorers trekked onward. Rain and fog were constant hazards. On November 7, 1805, as the fog lifted, they saw their destination. Clark wrote in his field notes, "Ocean in view, oh, the joy." They had reached the estuary of Gray's Bay, leading to the Pacific Ocean. They set up winter quarters in Fort Clatsop, named after the Clatsop tribe of the Chinook Indians of the region. In March of 1806, Lewis and Clark set out on their return journey. At one point, they split up. Lewis continued to search for the Northwest Passage. He tried different routes, hoping to find a direct water route between the Columbia and the Missouri. None was found. The return trip was easier to make than the trip west. They were now navigating downstream along the Missouri River. On September 23, 1806, they arrived in St. Louis. The expedition